Hello everyone, I am Mr. Disturbing, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Now, if you've ever driven through the winding back roads of Appalachian, Kentucky, you've probably seen those old mountain graveyards, the ones perched on hillsides like broken teeth, with weathered headstones tilting at odd angles and iron fencing that's more rust than metal. Most folks drive right past without a second thought, but there's one cemetery up on Cove Mountain that locals won't even mention by name. They just call it the Old Boneyard, and for good reason. What happened there back in 1952 is the kind of story that makes even the most skeptical mountain folk cross themselves and hurry past when the sun starts to set. The trouble started when the Mackenzie Brick Company decided to expand their operation. Times were good after the war, and there was plenty of demand for building materials as America rebuilt itself. Clay Mackenzie, the company's owner, had been eyeing a particular stretch of land on Cove Mountain for months. The soil surveys showed rich deposits of red clay, the kind that fired into beautiful, durable bricks that commanded top dollar in the construction market. The only problem was that the land sat directly beneath the old Mount Pisgah Cemetery, a forgotten burial ground that hadn't seen a fresh grave in nearly 50 years. The cemetery had been abandoned for decades, its records lost to time and neglect. Most of the headstones had crumbled or been claimed by the encroaching forest, and the few remaining markers were so weathered that the names were barely legible. Local authorities saw no issue with relocating the remains. After all, it appeared to be just another forgotten pioneer cemetery, and progress waited for no one. What they didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Mount Pisgah Cemetery held a secret that had been deliberately buried and forgotten. In 1823, a woman named Morna Blackwood had been accused of witchcraft by the God-fearing settlers of Cove Mountain. The charges were as old as they were terrible. Livestock dying mysteriously, crops failing, children falling ill with no explanation. Morna lived alone in a cabin deep in the hollows, gathering herbs and brewing remedies that the mountain folk both feared and secretly relied upon. When a particularly harsh winter claimed several lives, the community's simmering suspicions finally boiled over into mob justice. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than a day. Morna was convicted on testimony that ranged from the superstitious to the downright hysterical. But the townspeople, driven by fear and desperation, wanted more than just an execution. They wanted to ensure that whatever evil they believed dwelt within her could never return. So they devised a punishment that was both cruel and calculated. She would be buried alive in the very ground where her supposed victims lay, her body bound and weighted down with iron chains, and then covered with a mixture of consecrated earth and red clay from the mountain itself. The deed was carried out on a moonless night in November, with only a handful of the town's most respected men bearing witness. They dug the grave deep, far deeper than any Christian burial, and they bound Morna with iron chains, blessed by the traveling preacher who had pronounced her guilt. As they lowered her into the earth, still conscious and struggling, they poured the red clay over her like a crimson shroud. The last thing anyone heard was her voice, muffled but unmistakably clear, speaking words in a language that none of them recognized, but all of them feared. The location of that grave was never recorded in any official document. The men who carried out the execution took the secret with them to their own graves, and as the decades passed, the memory of Morna Blackwood faded into legend, then into whispered folklore, and finally into complete obscurity. Mount Pisgah Cemetery grew around that unmarked grave, with generations of mountain folk unknowingly laying their loved ones to rest above the restless remains of the woman they had murdered. When the Mackenzie Brick Company began their excavation in the spring of 1952, they had no idea what lay beneath the red clay soil. The first few days of digging proceeded without incident. Work crews removed the scattered headstones and the few identifiable remains, relocating them to a newer cemetery down the mountain. The red clay beneath proved to be even richer than the surveys had indicated. a deep, vibrant crimson that would produce bricks of exceptional quality and color. It was on the fourth day of excavation that they found her. The steam shovel operator, a man named Judd Henley, was working a particularly deep section of the pit when his bucket struck something that wasn't clay or stone. At first, he thought it was a tree root, or perhaps an old water pipe. But as he carefully scraped away the surrounding clay, the truth became horrifyingly clear. Wrapped in rusted iron chains and preserved by the unique mineral composition of the red clay, Morna Blackwood's body had remained intact for over a century. Judd's first instinct was to call for Clay Mackenzie, but something about the discovery made him hesitate. The body was positioned in an unnatural way, as if she had been struggling when the clay was poured over her. Her hands, still bound by the chains, were clawed and reaching upward, frozen in a final, desperate attempt to escape. Most disturbing of all were her eyes. They remained open, staring with an intensity that seemed to follow anyone who looked upon her. Clay Mackenzie arrived within the hour, accompanied by the local sheriff and the county coroner. The official determination was that they had uncovered the remains of an unknown individual, possibly a victim of foul play from the previous century. Given the advanced state of preservation and the unusual circumstances of the burial, it was decided that the body should be removed and given a proper Christian burial in the relocated cemetery. But as they lifted Morna's remains from the red clay, something changed in the very soil itself. The workers noticed it first. The clay seemed to pulse with a subtle warmth, as if it were alive. The color deepened from crimson to a shade so dark it was almost black, and there was a smell that none of them could quite identify, but all of them found deeply unsettling. It was earthy and organic, but underneath lay something else, something that reminded them of decay and old blood. Despite the strange phenomena, the excavation continued. There was money to be made, and the Mackenzie Brick Company had contracts to fulfill. The red clay was loaded into trucks and transported to the brick-making facility in the valley below, where it would be mixed with other materials, shaped, and fired in massive kilns. The process seemed to proceed normally at first, with the clay forming into bricks of an unusually beautiful deep red color that seemed to glow with an inner light. The first batch of bricks was completed within a week of the discovery. Clay Mackenzie was so pleased with the quality and appearance of the product that he decided to use some of the bricks for his own home renovation project. The rich color and smooth texture were unlike anything he had ever seen, and he knew that these bricks would be in high demand once word spread about their exceptional quality. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly. Clay started experiencing minor skin irritations shortly after handling the bricks. At first he attributed it to the lime and cement dust that was common in construction work, but as the days passed, the irritations became more pronounced. Small patches of his skin began to peel and flake away, leaving behind raw red patches that resembled fresh clay. Clay's wife, Hazel, noticed the changes first. She watched with growing concern as her husband's complexion took on a reddish hue, as if he were permanently flushed or sunburned. When she touched his skin, it felt warm and slightly damp, with a texture that reminded her uncomfortably of wet clay. She urged him to see a doctor, but Clay dismissed her concerns, insisting that it was just an allergic reaction that would clear up on its own. The other workers at the brick facility began experiencing similar symptoms. Tate Morrison, the kiln operator, developed painful blisters on his hands and arms that wept a reddish fluid. When the blisters burst, they left behind wounds that looked remarkably like chunks of clay had been scooped from his flesh. Reed Ashford, who worked in the molding department, found that his skin had become so sensitive that even the lightest touch would cause it to crumble and fall away like dried mud. Dr. Ezra Whitman, the local physician, was baffled by the condition. He had never seen anything like it in his 30 years of practice. The affected skin appeared to be undergoing some kind of mineral transformation, with normal human tissue being replaced by what looked and felt like hardened clay. Blood tests revealed elevated levels of iron and other minerals that were commonly found in clay deposits. But there was no medical explanation for how these substances could be replacing human tissue. As the weeks passed, the condition spread to anyone who had direct contact with the bricks. Construction workers, masons, and even the truck drivers who transported the bricks began developing the same symptoms. The transformation wasn't limited to the skin. It seemed to be working its way deeper into their bodies, affecting muscle tissue and even bone. Some of the afflicted reported feeling their joints stiffen and their movements become sluggish, as if their bodies were literally hardening from the inside out. The horror reached its peak when Wade Coulter, one of the younger workers, suffered what appeared to be a complete transformation. His skin had become so clay-like that it began to crack and crumble with each movement. On a particularly humid morning, as he was loading bricks onto a truck, his entire face simply fell away in large, wet chunks, revealing not flesh and bone underneath, but solid red clay. He stood there for a moment, faceless and impossibly alive, before his body began to collapse in on itself, like a poorly made sculpture exposed to rain. Word of the cursed bricks spread quickly through the mountain communities. People began to whisper about the old stories, the half-remembered tales of witches and curses that their grandparents had told around winter fires. The older residents, those who still remembered the oral traditions passed down through generations, began to piece together the connection between the mysterious burial and the current plague. It was Etta Crowley, an elderly woman who had lived on Cove Mountain her entire life, who finally spoke the truth that everyone had been afraid to acknowledge. She remembered the stories her grandmother had told her about Morna Blackwood and the terrible injustice that had been done to her. She knew that the red clay carried within it the woman's dying curse, and that everyone who touched it would eventually be claimed by the same earth that had claimed her. The revelation came too late for many of the affected workers. As their bodies continued to transform, they began to exhibit behaviors that suggested they were no longer entirely human. They would stand motionless for hours at a time, staring at nothing with eyes that had taken on the dull, reddish color of fired clay. When they moved, it was with a jerky, unnatural gait, as if they were marionettes being controlled by an unseen puppeteer. Most disturbing of all was their apparent loss of individual identity. The transformed workers seemed to share a collective consciousness, moving in perfect synchronization and responding to stimuli in exactly the same way. They would gather in groups, standing in perfect circles, their clay-like faces turned toward the mountain where Morna Blackwood's disturbed grave lay. Sometimes, observers reported, they would move their mouths as if speaking, but no sound would emerge, only small puffs of red dust that would drift away on the mountain breeze. The Mackenzie Brick Company was forced to shut down its operations as the full scope of the disaster became clear. The remaining inventory of bricks was quarantined, though by then it was too late. Hundreds of the cursed bricks had already been sold and used in construction projects throughout the region. Every building that incorporated the red clay bricks became a potential source of contamination, spreading the curse to anyone who came into prolonged contact with them. Clay Mackenzie himself was among the last to succumb to the transformation. His body had been changing gradually over the months, his skin taking on the texture and appearance of fired clay. But he retained his human consciousness longer than the others, perhaps because his exposure had been more gradual. In his final days, he spent hours writing in a journal, documenting the progression of his condition and trying to make sense of what was happening to him. His final entry, written in a handwriting that had become increasingly erratic as his fingers stiffened and hardened, described a series of dreams that had been plaguing him for weeks. In these dreams, he found himself standing in a vast underground chamber, filled with figures made of red clay. They were all people he recognized, his workers, his customers, everyone who had been touched by the cursed bricks. But at the center of the chamber stood a woman with wild, dark hair and eyes that burned with an inner fire. She spoke to him in those dreams, her voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once, telling him that he had awakened something that had been sleeping in the earth for over a century. The woman in his dreams was patient but implacable. She explained that the red clay was not just cursed, it was part of her, infused with her essence and her will. Everyone who touched it became part of her growing army, their human forms gradually replaced by vessels that she could inhabit and control. She had been waiting in the darkness for so long, bound by iron and buried beneath the weight of consecrated earth, but now she was free to reclaim the world that had rejected her. Clay's journal ended abruptly, the final words trailing off into illegible scratches and smears of what looked like dried clay. His body was found 3 days later, transformed into a perfect statue of red clay that stood in the center of his office, one hand raised as if in greeting or perhaps warning. The expression on his clay face was one of peaceful resignation, as if he had finally accepted his fate. The authorities tried to contain the spread of the curse by tracking down every brick that had been sold and every building that had used them. But the task proved to be impossible. The bricks had been scattered across 3 states, used in homes, businesses, and public buildings. Some of the infected bricks were found and destroyed, but many others remained hidden within walls and foundations, waiting for unsuspecting victims to come into contact with them. The abandoned brick factory became a focal point for the strange phenomena that continued to plague the region. Local residents reported seeing figures moving through the empty buildings at night, tall, shambling shapes that left trails of red dust in their wake. These apparitions seemed to be drawn to the factory, gathering in the same spots where the cursed bricks had been made, as if they were trying to return to their source. The most disturbing reports came from people who had lived in homes built with the red clay bricks. They described walls that seemed to pulse with a subtle warmth, as if something were alive within them. Some reported hearing whispers coming from inside the walls, soft voices speaking in languages they didn't recognize. Others claimed that their homes had begun to change shape subtly, with rooms becoming slightly larger or smaller, doorways shifting position, and hallways that seemed to stretch longer than they should. Children were particularly susceptible to the influence of the cursed bricks. They would often be found playing with invisible friends, building elaborate structures out of mud and clay that bore an uncanny resemblance to the figures that had been seen around the abandoned factory. When questioned about their games, the children would speak of a nice lady who lived in the walls and told them stories about the old days when the mountain was young. As the years passed, the curse seemed to evolve and adapt. The original victims, those who had been completely transformed into clay, gradually crumbled away, their forms unable to maintain coherence without constant exposure to the source of their transformation. But the curse itself persisted, finding new ways to manifest and spread. The red clay deposits in the area became permanently tainted, and any attempt to excavate or disturb them would result in the same symptoms that had plagued the original brickworkers. The Mount Pisgah Cemetery was eventually sealed off by the state authorities, though the official reason given was environmental contamination rather than supernatural activity. Warning signs were posted around the perimeter, and the area was designated as a restricted zone. But the barriers couldn't stop the curious or the desperate, and every few years someone would ignore the warnings and venture into the cursed ground. These trespassers rarely returned, and when they did, they brought with them evidence of the ongoing supernatural activity. Photographs showed strange formations in the red clay soil, shapes that looked almost like human figures trying to push their way up from below. Some images captured what appeared to be faces in the clay, their expressions frozen in silent screams or desperate pleas for help. The few survivors of these expeditions reported encounters with a woman who seemed to be made of living clay. She would appear without warning, her form shifting and changing as she moved. Sometimes she looked almost human, with recognizable features and flowing hair. Other times she appeared as a grotesque amalgamation of clay and bone, with hollow sockets where her eyes should be and a mouth that opened far too wide. But regardless of her appearance, her message was always the same. The mountain remembered, and the debt had not been paid. Local folklore began to incorporate the story of the cursed bricks into its rich tapestry of supernatural tales. Parents would warn their children to stay away from any construction site where red clay was being used, and to never touch bricks that had an unusually deep red color. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of disturbing the dead and the importance of respecting the old ways and the old places. The Mackenzie Brick Company property was eventually sold to a developer who planned to build a shopping center on the site. But the construction was halted when workers began experiencing the same symptoms that had plagued the original brick workers. The red clay in the soil seemed to be permanently contaminated, and any attempt to work with it resulted in the slow, horrifying transformation of human flesh into hardened clay. The property was abandoned once again, left to be reclaimed by the forest and the mountain itself. But the curse continued to spread, carried by wind and water to new locations throughout the region. Small pockets of contaminated clay began appearing in streams and valleys, and anyone who came into contact with them would begin the slow process of transformation. The state government eventually classified the entire Cove Mountain area as a geological hazard zone, citing unstable soil conditions and the potential for landslides. The official reports made no mention of the supernatural aspects of the contamination, but the restrictions effectively prevented any further development or excavation in the region. The mountain was left to itself and to the restless spirit that dwelt within its clay-rich soil. Modern paranormal investigators have attempted to study the phenomena, using sophisticated equipment to detect electromagnetic anomalies and temperature variations in the restricted area. Their findings have been inconclusive but disturbing. Thermal imaging cameras have captured heat signatures that appear to be moving through the clay deposits, following patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose. Audio equipment has recorded sounds that might be voices, speaking in languages that predate European settlement of the region. The curse of the red clay bricks has become one of the most documented supernatural phenomena in Appalachian folklore. Researchers have compiled dozens of eyewitness accounts, photographs, and physical evidence of the ongoing manifestations. But despite the wealth of documentation, the scientific community has been unable to provide a rational explanation for the events that began with the disturbance of Morna Blackwood's grave. The story serves as a reminder of the dark history that lies buried beneath the surface of the American landscape. The mountains of Appalachia have witnessed countless tragedies over the centuries, acts of violence, injustice, and cruelty that have left their mark on the very earth itself. The red clay curse is just one example of how the past refuses to stay buried, how the sins of previous generations can reach across time to claim new victims. Today, the abandoned brick factory stands as a monument to human hubris and the terrible consequences of disturbing forces beyond our understanding. The building itself has begun to change, with walls that seem to shift and flow like liquid clay. Vines and vegetation have grown over much of the structure, but they have taken on an unnatural reddish color, as if they too have been infected by the curse that emanates from the soil below. The few brave souls who have ventured near the ruins in recent years report that the air itself feels thick and oppressive, heavy with the weight of accumulated suffering and malevolent intent. They describe a sensation of being watched by unseen eyes, and a constant awareness that something ancient and hungry lies just beneath the surface of the earth, waiting for the right moment to emerge and reclaim what it believes is rightfully its own. The red clay curse of Cove Mountain continues to this day, a living testament to the power of injustice and the persistence of the human spirit, even in death. Those who know the story understand that some forces are too powerful to be contained by human law or buried by human hands. The mountain remembers, the clay remembers, and somewhere in the depths of the earth, Morna Blackwood waits with the patience of stone and the vengeance of the wrongfully dead. The curse serves as a warning to all who would disturb the sacred places of the past. The dead may sleep, but they do not always rest in peace. And when they awaken, they bring with them the accumulated weight of centuries of anger, seeking to balance the scales of justice in ways that the living can barely comprehend. The red clay bricks may have crumbled to dust, but the curse they carried lives on, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to disturb the restless sleep of the mountain's most infamous resident. In the end, the story of the red clay curse is more than just a tale of supernatural horror. It is a meditation on the nature of justice, the power of the land itself, and the terrible responsibility that comes with being the inheritors of a violent and troubled past. The mountains of Appalachia keep their secrets well, but sometimes when the conditions are right and the barriers between past and present grow thin, those secrets rise to the surface like clay from the depths of the earth, red and terrible and hungry for the light of day. You know, there are some stories that folks in the Appalachian Mountains don't like to talk about. Stories that get passed down in whispers, told only when the fire's burning low and the mountain mist rolls thick through the hollows. This is one of those stories, the kind that'll make you check your doors twice before bed and wonder what's really standing at the edge of the tree line when darkness falls. It happened in a place called Hollow Creek, nestled deep in the mountains where the old ways still held sway, and the hills themselves seemed to remember things that civilized folk had long forgotten. The town was small enough that everybody knew everybody, and old enough that the cemetery held graves from before the Civil War. But it was the history that came before those graves that really mattered, the history that most folks tried their best to forget. The trouble started with Boone Whitaker, the town's blacksmith. Boone had worked iron and steel for nigh on 40 years, his hands as steady as the day he first picked up a hammer. He was a practical man who dealt in practical things, horseshoes and nails, hinges and tools. But practicality has a way of abandoning a man when he stumbles across something that was never meant to be found. It was late autumn when Boone made his discovery. He'd been up in the high country, searching for a particular kind of iron ore that his grandfather had told him about. The kind that rang like a bell when you struck it and held an edge better than any steel. The old man had mentioned a place called Devil's Cleft, a narrow canyon that cut deep into the mountainside, where the rock formations twisted into unnatural shapes. Boone had always figured the stories about Devil's Cleft were just mountain folklore, the kind of tales that grew in the telling. But when he finally found the place, he understood why his grandfather's voice had dropped to a whisper when he spoke of it. The canyon walls rose like the ribs of some massive beast, and the shadows fell wrong somehow, as if the sun itself was reluctant to venture too deep into that cursed place. The metal he found there wasn't like anything he'd ever seen. It was black as midnight, but seemed to shimmer with an inner light when he held it up to the sky. The ore was warm to the touch, almost alive, and when he tested it with his hammer, the sound it made was like a church bell tolling for the dead. Every instinct told him to leave it where it lay, but the blacksmith in him couldn't resist such perfect material. What Boone didn't know, what nobody in Hollow Creek remembered anymore, was that Devil's Cleft had once been known by another name. 200 years earlier, it had been called Judgment Falls, and it was where the settlement's founders had brought those they deemed to be witches and devil worshippers. The practice had been swift and brutal, and when it was over, the bodies had been left to rot in the canyon's depths. The place had been sealed off and forgotten, its true name lost to time and shame. But the earth remembers everything, and the metal that Boone carried home was shot through with more than just minerals. It was infused with the pain and terror of those who had died there, their final moments crystallized into the very atoms of the ore. When he heated it in his forge, the metal didn't just glow, it pulsed like a heartbeat, and the shadows in his workshop seemed to dance with a life of their own. Boone worked through the night, shaping the cursed metal into a single perfect nail. It was about 6 inches long, with a head that seemed to catch and hold the light in ways that made his eyes water to look at it directly. The nail was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, mesmerizing and terrible at the same time. When dawn broke over Hollow Creek, Boone held the finished nail up to the morning light and felt a strange sense of completion wash over him. He'd created something special, something that would outlast him and all the generations that came after. What he felt wasn't pride. It was something darker, something that made his soul shrivel just a little bit more. The nail's first miracle happened 3 days later. Agnes Caldwell, the town's oldest resident, had been dying slowly for months. Her body was failing, her mind was going, and everyone knew it was just a matter of time. But her granddaughter Vera couldn't bear to watch the old woman suffer anymore. She'd heard whispers about Boone's strange new creation, about the nail that seemed to possess properties beyond the natural world. Vera came to the smithy on a gray October morning, her eyes red with crying and her hands shaking with desperation. She begged Boone to help her grandmother, to use whatever power the nail possessed to ease the old woman's pain. Boone hesitated. Something deep in his gut told him that using the nail would be a mistake of the worst kind. But Vera's tears wore down his resistance, and eventually he agreed. The ritual was simple enough. Boone drove the nail into the doorframe of Agnes's bedroom, and within minutes, the change began. Color returned to the old woman's cheeks, her breathing became steady and strong, and her eyes cleared for the first time in months. Agnes sat up in bed and asked for breakfast, her voice clear and strong. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. But miracles, as any mountain person will tell you, always come with a price. When the sun rose the next morning, little Tess Harmon was gone. The 7-year-old had vanished from her bed sometime during the night, with no sign of struggle or forced entry. Her parents searched every inch of their small cabin, then expanded their search to the entire town. They found no trace of the child, no footprints, no torn clothing, no sign that she had ever existed at all. What they did find was infinitely more disturbing. At the edge of the forest, where the trees grew thick and the shadows fell deep, stood a small figure made of red clay and mountain earth. The figure was crude but unmistakably childlike, with features that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to little Tess. It stood perfectly still, facing the town with empty eye sockets that seemed to watch everything and nothing at the same time. The connection between the nail's use and Tess's disappearance wasn't immediately apparent. Hollow Creek was a small town, but it wasn't so small that the loss of one child would automatically be linked to an old woman's miraculous recovery. People talked, of course, but mountain folk were used to strange happenings. Children sometimes wandered off and got lost in the woods, and the clay figure was dismissed as some sort of natural formation or perhaps a prank by bored teenagers. But Boone knew better. He'd felt something drain out of him when he'd driven the nail into Agnes's doorframe, something essential and irreplaceable. And when he'd walked past the clay figure at the forest's edge, he'd felt a horrible recognition wash over him. The nail wasn't just healing, it was trading life for life, innocence for innocence. The children weren't dying, they were being transformed, their essence somehow transferred into the crude earthen forms that watched over the town like silent sentinels. The second miracle came 2 weeks later. Reed Morrison, the town's only doctor, had been suffering from a cancer that was eating him alive from the inside. His wife Hazel had watched him waste away for months, his body becoming more skeletal with each passing day. When she heard about Agnes's recovery, she knew she had to try the nail, no matter what the cost might be. Hazel came to Boone in the middle of the night, her desperation palpable in the darkness of the smithy. She offered him everything she had, money, livestock, even her own life if necessary. All she wanted was for her husband to live, to be whole again. Boone tried to refuse, tried to explain that the nail came with a price too terrible to pay. But Hazel wouldn't listen, and eventually his resolve crumbled once again. The nail was driven into the threshold of the Morrison house, and once again the results were immediate and miraculous. Reed's color returned, his strength came back, and the cancer that had been consuming him simply vanished. He was whole again, healthy in a way that defied all medical explanation. But the price was paid in full when young Eli Bradshaw disappeared the next morning. The 8-year-old had been playing in his yard when the sun went down, and by dawn, he was gone. His parents found another clay figure at the forest's edge. This one slightly taller than the first, with features that bore an unmistakable resemblance to their lost son. The pattern was becoming clear, even to those who didn't want to see it. The nail could heal, could grant wishes and work miracles, but each use required a sacrifice. The children of Hollow Creek were being claimed one by one, their lives traded for the health and happiness of the adults who should have been protecting them. As autumn deepened into winter, the requests kept coming. Nash Garrett wanted the nail to heal his broken leg. Ivy Brennan begged for it to bring her husband back from the war. Lyle Hutchins thought it might be able to restore his failing eyesight. Each time, Boone felt the weight of what he was doing, but each time he found himself unable to refuse. The nail seemed to have a will of its own, drawing desperate people to it like moths to a flame. And each time the nail was used, another child vanished, and another clay figure appeared at the forest's edge. The figures began to form a rough circle around the town, their empty eye sockets all turned inward, watching with the patience of the dead. Parents began to keep their children inside after dark, but it made no difference. The nail took who it wanted, when it wanted, and no lock or prayer could stop it. The winter was harsh that year, harsher than anyone could remember. The snow fell deep and stayed long, and the wind howled through the mountains like the voices of the damned. But the cold wasn't the worst part. It was the silence. The laughter of children had vanished from Hollow Creek, replaced by the whispered fears of parents who knew their turn was coming. By spring, 17 children had disappeared, and 17 clay figures stood watch at the forest's edge. The town had become a place of miracles and horror, where the sick were healed and the desperate found their wishes granted. but where innocence was the currency and childhood was the cost. The end came on a warm May evening when the last child in Hollow Creek, a girl named Mara Collins, vanished from her bed. Her parents had tried everything to protect her, had never asked for the Nails' help, had even considered leaving town. But the Nails' hunger was too great, its thirst too deep. It had consumed all the children it could find, and now it was ready for the final act. Boone found Mara's clay figure the next morning, standing not at the forest's edge but directly in front of his smithy. This figure was different from the others, more detailed, more lifelike, with features that seemed almost ready to speak. As he approached it, he felt a presence watching him from behind those empty eye sockets, a consciousness that was both familiar and alien. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The children weren't gone. They were still here, trapped in the clay forms, aware but unable to move or speak or escape. They had been watching the town all along, witnessing the adults who had traded their lives for momentary happiness. The nail hadn't just taken their bodies. It had imprisoned their souls in earthen shells, turning them into unwilling guardians of the cursed place. That night, Boone made his decision. He took the nail from its resting place and walked to the center of town, where the oldest oak tree stood. The tree had been there since before the settlement was founded, its roots deep in the mountain soil, its branches reaching toward the stars. It was a place of power, a place where the old ways still held sway. As he raised the nail above his head, preparing to drive it into the tree's ancient bark, Boone felt the weight of what he was about to do. The nail would be sealed away, its power contained, but the children would remain trapped in their clay prisons. There was no way to undo what had been done, no way to restore what had been lost. The nail went into the tree with a sound like thunder, and the earth itself seemed to shudder. The clay figures at the forest's edge began to move, walking slowly toward the town center with steps that left no tracks. They formed a circle around the oak tree, their empty eye sockets fixed on the nail that protruded from the bark like a black dagger. As the sun rose over Hollow Creek, the nail began to sink into the tree, the ancient wood closing around it like a wound that was healing. The clay figures stood their vigil, neither moving nor speaking, their presence a constant reminder of the price that had been paid for the town's miracles. Boone lived for another 20 years, but he never worked iron again. His hands shook too much, and his dreams were filled with the faces of children who would never grow up. He became a broken man, haunted by the knowledge of what he had created and what it had cost. When he finally died, some say his spirit joined the children in their eternal watch, another guardian cursed to stand vigil over the town's terrible secret. The town of Hollow Creek still exists, though most maps don't show it anymore. The oak tree still stands in the center of town, its bark scarred but whole, hiding the nail that sleeps within its heartwood. And on quiet nights, when the moon is dark and the mist rolls thick through the hollows, you can still see them, the clay figures standing at the forest's edge, watching and waiting with the patience of the dead. The adults who received the nail's gifts lived long lives, but they were hollow lives, empty of the joy that children bring. They had traded the future for the present, innocence for experience, and the bargain left them with nothing but years of regret and the knowledge that they had damned their own young. Local folklore says that the nail still holds power, that it's just waiting for someone desperate enough to dig it out of the oak tree's heart. They say that on certain nights, when the conditions are just right, you can hear the sound of children laughing in the distance. Not the joyful laughter of the living, but the hollow echo of voices that can never be stilled. The clay figures remain, weathered by time, but somehow eternal. New visitors to Hollow Creek sometimes mistake them for art installations or historical markers, but the locals know better. They're a warning and a reminder, a testament to the price of miracles and the cost of desperate choices. There are rules that the remaining families follow, rules that have been passed down through generations. Never walk alone after dark, never stray too close to the forest's edge, never speak of the nail or what it could do, and most importantly, never disturb the clay figures that stand their endless watch, for they are all that remains of childhood in a place where innocence was bartered away for temporal blessings. The story of Hollow Creek serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of playing with forces beyond our understanding. It reminds us that every miracle has a price, Every wish comes with consequences, and sometimes the cost of getting what we want is far greater than we can imagine. The nail may be buried deep in the oak tree's heart, but its legacy lives on in the clay figures that guard the town's borders, eternal sentinels watching over a place where the laughter of children will never be heard again. On foggy mornings, when the mist clings to the mountains like the breath of ghosts, residents of Hollow Creek sometimes catch glimpses of movement among the clay figures. They turn their heads, they shift their positions, they seem to communicate with each other in ways that living eyes cannot fully comprehend. The children are still there, still watching, still waiting for a justice that may never come. The nail sleeps in its wooden prison, its power contained but not destroyed. It dreams of miracles and wishes, of desperate people willing to pay any price for their heart's desire. And somewhere in those dreams, the laughter of children echoes like a promise and a threat, a reminder that some prices are too high to pay, and some bargains should never be made. The mountains remember everything, and in Hollow Creek, the past is never truly past. The clay figures stand their vigil, the oak tree guards its secret, and the town exists in a state of perpetual twilight, neither fully alive nor completely dead, but something in between, something that serves as a warning to those who would dare to tamper with the natural order of things. This is the story of Hollow Creek and the nail that brought miracles to a mountain town. It's a story that the locals don't like to tell, but it's a story that needs to be remembered, because somewhere in the mountains, in places where the old ways still hold sway and the shadows fall wrong, there are still objects of power waiting to be found. And when they are found, when desperate people make desperate choices, the children are always the ones who pay the price. The clay figures at the forest's edge stand as eternal witnesses to this truth, their empty eye sockets reflecting the cost of miracles and the weight of choices that can never be undone. They are the guardians of Hollow Creek, the keepers of its terrible secret, and the reminder that some stories are too important to forget, no matter how much we might want to. There are some stories that stick with you long after you've heard them, the kind that make you double-check your locks at night and avoid looking out dark windows. This is one of those stories. It happened in a place most folks have never heard of, a tiny mountain town called Hollow Creek, nestled deep in the Appalachian wilderness of West Virginia. Now, if you've never been to that part of the country, let me paint you a picture. We're talking about a place where the mountains seem to swallow the sun whole, where the trees grow so thick you can't see 10 feet in any direction, and where the old ways of thinking never quite died out. The people of Hollow Creek have lived the same way for generations. They're hard-working, God-fearing folks who mind their own business and expect others to do the same. Most of them have never been more than 50 miles from where they were born, and they like it that way. The town itself is nothing more than a cluster of weathered houses scattered along a winding dirt road, with a small general store, a church, and not much else. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are hard to keep, and where strange things have a way of happening when the sun goes down. But in the winter of 1987, something came to Hollow Creek that tested the limits of what even these mountain people could accept. Something that would leave 3 families destroyed and an entire community living in fear. The locals called it the Goat Man, though none of them had ever seen anything quite like it before, and once it started visiting their homes, nothing would ever be the same again. The first person to encounter the creature was Ruth Caldwell, a widow in her 60s who lived alone in a small cabin at the edge of town. Ruth had been living in that same house for 43 years, ever since she married her late husband Clyde. She was a tough old bird, the kind of woman who could split firewood with the best of them and wasn't afraid of much. But on the night of December 15, 1987, something changed all of that. Ruth had always been a light sleeper, a habit she'd developed during the years when her husband worked the night shift at the coal mine. So when she heard the sound of footsteps on her front porch at exactly 2:17 a.m., she was instantly awake. At first she thought it might be a deer or perhaps a raccoon getting into her garbage. But as she lay there listening, she realized the footsteps were too deliberate, too rhythmic to belong to any animal she knew. The footsteps moved slowly across the length of her porch, from the left side to the right, then back again. They had a strange quality to them, heavy but not quite right. There was something about the gait that seemed almost human, but with an odd shuffle that made Ruth's skin crawl. She pulled her quilt up to her chin and listened as the footsteps continued their slow parade back and forth across her porch. Then came the sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A low, guttural bleating that was unmistakably goat-like, but somehow deeper and more resonant than any goat she'd ever heard. The sound seemed to come from directly outside her bedroom window, and it sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the December cold. Ruth lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the creature continued its patrol. She could hear it sniffing around her front door, making soft grunting noises as it investigated the entrance to her home. The bleating came again, longer this time, and Ruth realized with growing horror that the sound was almost melodic, as if the creature were singing some ancient, wordless song. For what felt like hours, the thing continued its vigil outside her home. Ruth never once considered getting up to look out the window. Something deep in her mountain-bred instincts told her that seeing the creature would be a mistake she couldn't undo. Instead, she lay there in her bed, listening to the steady shuffle of feet and the occasional bleat, until finally, just before dawn, the sounds faded away. The next morning, Ruth found hoofprints in the mud outside her front door. They were unlike any animal tracks she'd ever seen, larger than a goat's, but with the same cloven shape. What disturbed her most was that mixed in with the hoofprints were what appeared to be human footprints, as if the creature had been walking upright on two legs. Ruth told no one about her midnight visitor. In a small town like Hollow Creek, strange stories had a way of making people look at you differently, and Ruth valued her reputation as a sensible woman. But she did start keeping a loaded shotgun beside her bed, and she made sure to lock her doors every night, something she'd never felt the need to do before. 3 nights later, the creature visited the home of Wade Morrison, a coal miner who lived with his wife Hazel and their 2 young children in a modest house near the center of town. Wade was a practical man who didn't believe in ghosts or monsters, but he was also a light sleeper thanks to years of working unpredictable shifts at the mine. The sound that woke him was the same slow, deliberate footsteps that had terrorized Ruth Caldwell. But Wade's house was larger than Ruth's cabin, and the creature took its time exploring every inch of the property. Wade lay in bed next to his sleeping wife, listening as the thing walked around the perimeter of their home, pausing at each window and door as if conducting some kind of inspection. The bleating started when the creature reached the back of the house, where Wade's children slept. The sound was louder this time, more insistent, and Wade felt a primal fear unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He wanted to grab his hunting rifle and confront whatever was out there, but something held him back. The same instinct that had kept Ruth in her bed now kept Wade frozen under his covers. The creature spent nearly an hour circling the Morrison house, and Wade could hear it testing the doors and windows, rattling the handles and frames with what sounded like human hands. At one point, the thing seemed to pause directly outside the bedroom where Wade and Hazel slept, and Wade could swear he heard the sound of breathing, slow, deep, and unnaturally loud. Just like with Ruth, the creature disappeared before dawn, leaving only strange tracks in the mud and a lingering sense of dread that would follow Wade for the rest of his life. He too said nothing about his experience, though he did start checking and rechecking his locks every night and found himself glancing nervously at the windows whenever darkness fell. The pattern continued for weeks. Every few nights, the creature would visit a different home in Hollow Creek, always arriving at approximately 2 a.m. and always following the same routine. It would circle the house, test the doors and windows, and fill the air with its unsettling bleating. The residents who experienced these visits found themselves changed by the encounters, jumping at shadows and losing sleep as they waited for the creature's return. But the thing that made the situation truly terrifying was that the creature was escalating its behavior. What had started as simple surveillance began to evolve into something more aggressive. The bleating grew louder and more frequent. The creature began staying longer, sometimes until nearly sunrise, and most disturbing of all, it started knocking on doors. The first person to experience the creature's knock was Levi Hutchins, a bachelor who lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. Levi worked as a handyman and was known for his steady nerves and practical approach to life. He wasn't the type to be easily frightened, but when he heard the first knock on his front door at 2:23 a.m. on a cold January night, he knew immediately that something was wrong. The knock was deliberate and methodical. 3 slow, heavy blows that seemed to shake the entire house. Levi lay in his bed, every muscle in his body tense, as the creature waited outside his door. For several minutes there was silence. Then came the bleating, louder and more urgent than anyone had heard before. The sound seemed to fill the entire house, resonating through the walls and floorboards like some kind of supernatural bass note. The knocking came again, this time more insistent. The creature was using what sounded like human fists, pounding on the door with increasing force. Levi could hear the wood creaking under the assault, and for a moment he thought the door might actually give way. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. The creature let out one final, prolonged bleat, and then fell silent. Levi didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat in his kitchen with a loaded rifle across his lap, watching the front door and waiting for the creature to return. But dawn came and went without incident, and eventually, Levi convinced himself that the danger had passed. He was wrong. The next morning, Levi woke up feeling strange. Not sick, exactly, but different. There was a heaviness in his chest, a difficulty breathing that he'd never experienced before. He attributed it to stress and lack of sleep, but as the day progressed, the feeling grew worse. By afternoon, he was struggling to catch his breath, and by evening, he was gasping like a fish out of water. Levi's neighbor, Clay Brennan, found him the next morning. Levi was lying in his bed, his eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. The coroner said it looked like he'd suffocated, but there was no explanation for why. His lungs were clear, his airways were open, and there was no sign of disease or injury. It was as if something had simply stolen the breath from his body. The death might have been dismissed as a medical mystery, if not for what happened next. Within a week of Levi's funeral, the creature visited the home of Tess Wynn, a young mother who lived with her husband and infant daughter in a house near the church. The pattern was the same. The slow footsteps, the circling, the bleating, and finally, the knocking. Tess heard the 3 deliberate knocks on her front door at exactly 2 a.m., followed by the creature's haunting song. She lay in bed beside her sleeping husband, clutching their baby daughter and praying that the thing would go away. But the knocking came again, harder this time, and Tess could hear the door straining against its hinges. The creature spent nearly 2 hours outside the Wynn house, alternating between periods of silence and bouts of frenzied activity. It knocked on every door and window, bleating constantly as it moved around the perimeter of the property. At one point, Tess was certain she could hear it on the roof, walking back and forth across the shingles with its strange, shuffling gait. When morning came, Tess's husband found hoof prints and handprints all over their property. The prints were everywhere, on the walls, around the windows, even on the roof, where Tess had heard the creature walking. But what disturbed him most was the sight of the front door, which was covered in what looked like claw marks, as if something had been trying to tear its way inside. That night, Tess went to bed feeling perfectly healthy. She nursed her baby, kissed her husband goodnight, and fell asleep without any trouble. But when her husband woke up the next morning, he found Tess lying beside him with her eyes rolled back in her head, her body rigid and cold. The baby was still sleeping peacefully in her arms, completely unharmed. The doctor who examined Tess's body was baffled. She showed no signs of trauma, no indication of disease, no explanation for her sudden death. Her heart had simply stopped beating sometime during the night, as if something had reached into her chest and switched off the engine of her life. Now the people of Hollow Creek began to understand that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple animal. The creature wasn't just visiting their homes, it was hunting. And those who received its knock were being marked for death. The third victim was Nash Corbett, a middle-aged farmer who lived with his elderly mother in a house that had been in their family for generations. Nash was a skeptical man who had dismissed the earlier deaths as coincidence, but when he heard the creature's footsteps on his porch at 2:15 a.m. on a cold February night, he knew that his skepticism had been a mistake. The ritual was the same as always: the slow circling, the investigation of doors and windows, the unsettling bleating that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But this time, Nash decided to fight back. He grabbed his shotgun and crept toward the front door, determined to confront whatever was terrorizing his community. As he approached the door, Nash could hear the creature breathing on the other side. It was a deep, ragged sound that seemed almost human, but with an animalistic quality that made his skin crawl. The creature was so close that Nash could feel its presence through the wood, and for a moment he hesitated. That hesitation saved his life. Just as Nash reached for the door handle, the knocking began. 3 thunderous blows that shook the entire house and sent Nash stumbling backward. The creature was using tremendous force, and Nash realized that opening the door would have been suicide. Instead, he backed away and waited, his shotgun trained on the entrance as the creature continued its assault. The creature visited Opal's house on a night when the wind was howling through the mountains, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. The sound of its footsteps was almost lost in the storm, but Opal had been listening for it every night, and she recognized the rhythmic shuffle immediately. This time, the creature seemed different, more aggressive, more purposeful. It didn't spend time circling the house or testing the windows. Instead, it went straight to the front door and began knocking with tremendous force. The blows were so powerful that they knocked pictures off the walls and rattled the windows in their frames. Opal huddled in her bedroom, clutching a Bible and praying for protection. But the creature wasn't deterred by her faith. It continued its assault on the door, and Opal could hear the wood beginning to splinter. She realized with growing horror that the creature was actually going to break down the door. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. The creature let out a long, triumphant bleat and then fell silent. Opal waited in terror for what felt like hours, but the creature had gone. She had been marked for death, and they both knew it. Opal's death was the most disturbing yet. She was found the next morning by her neighbor, May Atkins, who had come to check on her. Opal was sitting in her rocking chair, perfectly positioned as if she'd been reading, but her eyes were gone. They had been carefully removed from her skull, leaving empty sockets that stared blindly at the ceiling. The coroner was horrified by the precision of the wounds. Whatever had taken Opal's eyes had done so with surgical skill, leaving no other marks on her body. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that she had even tried to defend herself. It was as if she had simply sat there and allowed the creature to do its work. May Atkins was the one who finally broke the silence that had gripped the town. She stood up in church the following Sunday and told the remaining congregation everything she knew about the creature. She described the footsteps, the bleeding, the knocking, and the horrible deaths that followed. She begged the other residents to leave town while they still could. But there was one person in the church who had a different idea. Elder Zeke Holbrook was the town's oldest resident, a man who remembered stories his grandfather had told him about the old days in the mountains. He claimed to know what the creature was and how to stop it. According to Elder Holbrook, the thing terrorizing Hollow Creek was what the old-timers called a goatman, a creature that was neither fully human nor fully animal, but something in between. These beings were said to be the result of ancient curses or dark rituals, and they were drawn to communities where fear and desperation ran high. The elder explained that the goatman fed on terror and death, growing stronger with each life it claimed. The knocking ritual was how it marked its victims, creating a spiritual connection that allowed it to claim their souls. But there was a way to stop it, he said. The creature could be banished, but only if someone was willing to face it directly and break the cycle of fear. The plan Elder Holbrook proposed was simple but terrifying. Someone would have to stay awake and wait for the creature to visit their home. When it knocked on the door, they would have to answer it, not to fight it, but to confront it with complete absence of fear. The creature fed on terror, and if it encountered someone who refused to be afraid, it would lose its power and be forced to leave. Most of the congregation thought the old man had lost his mind. The idea of opening a door to the creature seemed like suicide, but one person was desperate enough to try anything. Hazel Morrison, the widow of Wade Morrison, had been living with the knowledge that the creature might return to her home at any time. Her husband had died in a mining accident a few months after his encounter with the goatman, and Hazel was convinced that the creature had somehow caused his death. She had 2 young children to protect, and she was willing to do whatever it took to keep them safe. On the night of March 15, 1988, Hazel prepared for what she knew might be her final battle. She sent her children to stay with relatives in another town and she spent the day in prayer and meditation, trying to purge every trace of fear from her heart. She knew that if Elder Holbrook was right, her emotional state would determine whether she lived or died. The creature arrived at exactly 2 a.m., just as it always did. Hazel heard the familiar footsteps on her porch, followed by the slow bleating that had haunted her dreams for months. She stood in her living room, facing the front door, and waited. The creature took its time, circling the house and testing the windows as it always did. But Hazel could sense that something was different. The bleating was more urgent, more questioning, as if the creature was confused by her behavior. She wasn't hiding in her bedroom or cowering in fear. She was standing in the open, waiting for it to come to her. When the knocking finally came, it was different from what others had described. Instead of the violent pounding that had terrified previous victims, the creature knocked almost gently. 3 soft taps that seemed almost hesitant. Hazel took a deep breath, walked to the door, and opened it without hesitation. What she saw standing on her porch defied description. The creature was tall and humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its legs were too long, its arms too short, and its head was unmistakably that of a goat, but larger and more intelligent than any goat had a right to be. Its eyes glowed with an inner light that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul. For a moment, neither of them moved. The creature seemed as surprised to see her as she was to see it. Then, slowly, it opened its mouth and let out a low, questioning bleat. Hazel realized that it was trying to communicate with her, to understand why she wasn't afraid. In that moment, Hazel understood something that Elder Holbrook hadn't mentioned. The creature wasn't evil in the traditional sense. It was lonely. It had been wandering the mountains for decades, perhaps centuries, feeding on fear because that was the only form of human emotion it knew how to absorb. It knocked on doors because it wanted to be invited in, to be accepted as part of the community it had been watching from the shadows. But fear was a poison that had corrupted the creature over time, turning it into something monstrous and hungry. The deaths it had caused weren't intentional. They were the result of its toxic nature, the inevitable consequence of a being that had been feeding on terror for too long. Hazel stood in her doorway, looking into the creature's glowing eyes, and felt something she hadn't expected: pity. This thing had once been something else, something that might have been capable of gentleness or even love. But years of feeding on fear had turned it into a predator, and it no longer remembered how to be anything else. The creature seemed to sense her thoughts. It let out a long, mournful bleat that sounded less like a goat and more like a cry of pain. Then, without another sound, it turned and walked away into the darkness. Hazel watched it go, and somehow she knew that it wouldn't be coming back. The next morning, Hazel found something on her porch that confirmed her suspicions. Instead of the hoofprints and claw marks that had appeared at every other home the creature had visited, there was a single white flower, a mountain laurel that hadn't been there the night before. It was the creature's way of saying goodbye. The goatman never returned to Hollow Creek. The town slowly began to recover from its months of terror, though many of the residents who had fled never came back. The school closed permanently when Opal Summers died, and the general store eventually went out of business. Today, Hollow Creek is little more than a ghost town, with only a few stubborn families still calling it home. But the story of the goatman lives on in the mountains. People in neighboring towns still talk about what happened in Hollow Creek, and there are those who claim to have seen similar creatures in other parts of Appalachia. Some say that the goatman was one of many such beings, ancient spirits that were once connected to the land but became corrupted by human fear and violence. Elder Holbrook died shortly after the creature's final visit, taking most of his knowledge about the old ways with him. But before he passed, he told Hazel something that she never forgot. He said that the mountains were full of things that existed in the spaces between the natural and supernatural worlds, and that most of them weren't evil by nature. They became dangerous only when humans treated them with fear and hatred instead of understanding and respect. Hazel Morrison still lives in Hollow Creek today, one of the few remaining residents of the dying town. She's an old woman now, but she remembers every detail of that night in 1988 when she faced the goatman. She never speaks about it to outsiders, but those who know her well say that she sometimes leaves flowers on her porch on the anniversary of the creature's final visit. The official records of Hollow Creek make no mention of the goatman or the 4 deaths that occurred during those terrible months. The county coroner filed his reports, listing the deaths as natural causes or accidents, and the state authorities never investigated further. As far as the outside world is concerned, nothing unusual ever happened in that small mountain town. But the people who lived through those events know better. They know that there are things in this world that can't be explained by science or logic. Things that exist in the dark spaces between what we know and what we fear. They know that the mountains hold secrets that go back further than recorded history, and that some of those secrets are better left undisturbed. The story of the Goatman of Hollow Creek serves as a reminder that not all monsters are born evil. Sometimes they're created by our own fear and ignorance. And sometimes the only way to defeat them is to face them with courage and understanding, to see past the horror to the pain that lies beneath. In the end, the creature that terrorized Hollow Creek was more tragic than terrifying. It was a being that had been twisted by centuries of fear and isolation, turned into something monstrous by the very emotions it fed upon. When Hazel Morrison chose to face it without fear, she broke the cycle that had kept it trapped in its predatory nature. She showed it that there was another way to exist, and in doing so, she set it free. The mountains of Appalachia are vast and ancient, full of hidden valleys and forgotten settlements. Who knows what other creatures might be wandering those remote places, sustained by fear and loneliness, waiting for someone brave enough to offer them a different kind of sustenance? The story of Hollow Creek suggests that sometimes the most effective way to banish a monster is not to fight it, but to understand it. And perhaps that's the most unsettling truth of all, that the things we fear most might not be so different from us after all. They might just be lost souls wandering in the darkness, looking for someone to open a door and invite them into the light.